This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited Magic. Still talking about Wilds of Eldraine Limited. It's still a relatively new format, and today I'm going to do the kind of video I do for every limited format these days, which is 10 cards that are bad that you should stop playing in this limited format. Basically, what I'm going to do in this video is combine both my impression of the format, like 30 drafts in, with data from 17 Lands. 17lands.com is a great website for limited data. You can sign up to have it track your data, and it is a database of lots of people who've signed up to have their data tracked, and you can find out what the win rates of cards are and stuff like that. It's not the end-all be-all. The data on there doesn't mean, if a card has a higher win percentage, it doesn't mean you should always take that above another card. There's a lot of contextual things you have to keep in mind, but it is really interesting data that we can use to help us analyze limited formats. As usual, I'm starting with a baseline card. This lets me introduce the 17 lands data to you, and also gives us a card, obviously, to compare all the other cards we're going to talk about too. The card I went with this time is Merry Bards. It has a 54.6% win rate, and that is game in hand win rate, if you're curious about which win rate that is. That means if this card ends up in your hand in any way, shape, or form during a game, that's how often you'll win the game. And this is a particularly good stat to use because it takes into account cards that get stuck in your hand and that you never play, right? You shouldn't only be looking at how good a card is when it gets cast, because that doesn't really tell the whole story. You can use that sort of win percentage, but what matters more is what a card's win percentage is in general, because, if it gets stuck in your hand and you can't cast it, that's an important part of the story. So that win rate sounds better than it actually is, because obviously Magic is a zero-sum game, so if you take everyone's win percentage, you end up with 50% of the time people win and 50% of the time people lose, right? So 54.6 sounds good, but the people on 17 lands have a higher than normal win rate because they are generally people who are very into limited and interested in improving in limited. And so the average win rate for this format right now over on 17 lands is about 55.3%. So in other words, Merry Bards is like right around average, maybe a little worse than average. And it's not a great card. I think we can all agree, 2 generic and a red for a 3/2 isn't great. And paying 1 more mana to get a Young Hero roll token on top of it, sure, it triggers your celebration and it buffs a creature immediately, but you're still kind of not really getting a great deal in the end when you play this card. It's fine. You'll end up playing them in your aggressive red decks for sure, but it's not anything special. And it's picked around 9.4. So that's the average pick, out of 15 cards, where this card is taken. So every single card on this list is taken before Merry Bards, but has a lower win rate. So that's sort of why it's the baseline card. So in other words, these cards are being taken higher than they should be. And I'm going to go through each of these cards and tell you what it is about this particular card that has made it sort of fall flat in the format. And we're going to start with Mocking Sprite. So this has a 53% win rate, which is not good, and it's taken around pick 8.4. So what's the problem here? Well, the main thing is just the stat line. On paper, 2 generic and a blue for a 2/1 that reduces the cost of instants and sorceries doesn't sound too bad. Also, it's a fairy, right? That matters for a few cards in the set. But it turns out being a 3-mana 2/1 is a huge liability in this format. You just can't play things in this format that don't do something else and cost more than 1 mana and have 1 toughness. And this is because the format is filled with things that punish 1 toughness, including adventures, like the 3-mana 2/2 Otter that has the 1 red mana do 1 to something adventure. Like if your opponent can pay way less mana to kill your creature and not even use a whole card, that's a really good way to end up way behind. There's also the 1 generic and a white 2/2 who has an adventure that's 1 generic and a black. Give everything -1/-1. Then there's Rat Out, which is 1 black mana to give something -1/-1 and make a rat token. And that's not even everything. Those are just the ones that pop into my head. And so you end up way behind on mana when your opponent just plays one of those, and on cards if it happens to be one of the adventures. And that's just not where you want to be. So, if you play this thing, you often end up behind in mana and behind in cards. And that's what leads to it having a pretty low win rate. I mean, it's not the worst card ever or anything, right? but it's being taken higher than it should be. And most of the time, it shouldn't make your cut, even in your blue-red or blue-black decks where it looks like it would make sense. This is like a D-level card that you should be not playing unless you desperately have to. That's kind of how it's panned out. It just turns out it's not very good. Next up, let's look at Frostbridge Guard. It has a win rate of 52.2%, and it's taken right around the same place as Mary Bard's, 9.38. So this is kind of a stand-in for all the tap stuff. There's one exception to this. The tap Signpost Uncommon Charade is good. She's good all on her own. She gives you plenty of value as a 4-mana 2/3 tap something, draw a card. That's all you need, right? But basically everything else in the set that has the word tap on it has a low win rate. And going into the format, that was, you know, I've been wrong about some stuff, and we're going to see some more of it in this video. I talked about some of it in the last video. But one thing I ended up being right about is that the tap deck isn't a real thing, like 99% of the time. And so all these cards that tap things or pay you off for tapping things have a win rate below what would be, you know, passable. And Frostbridge Guard is one of these. You know, we've come a long way in Limited to the point where a 2-mana 2/2 with upside just isn't that good anymore. You need more than that. And part of the problem for Frostbridge Guard in this format, even if we remove ourselves from the tap deck, even being a thing, is just that you don't find yourself that often in this format wanting to spend 3 mana to tap something. This format, a lot of the time, is aggressive. And it just involves, if it's an aggro mirror, you and your opponent are just attacking each other anyway and hoping to kill the other faster. And this tap effect doesn't matter there. And then if you're a slower deck and you played this out on turn 2, and you know, you're kind of hoping you can trade with it maybe, but then the format has a bunch of good tricks that will just run this thing over. It's just not an efficient enough creature, a good enough creature on its own when you take the tap effect away, which is most of the time what happens for it to be good. And then all the tap payoffs didn't really pan out. I mean, there's the Mythic Rare one, which is obviously really good too. But, you know, it actually being a consistent deck, like it being blue-white's theme, just doesn't pan out. And that's why a card like Frostbridge Guard is bad. But you can also throw in the 3-mana 2/3 Vigilance that can tap things when it attacks. It gets bigger when things tapped. You can throw in the enchantment that taps something and stuns it and puts a counter on one of your things. Those all have horrible win rates, as do the random like freeze cards and the one generic and a white, tap a creature, scry 1, draw a card. Like all of them have bad win rates. Frostbridge Guard is sort of the stand-in here because, you know, I think it's worth noting that, you know, the others, it's kind of maybe not as surprising that they're bad because they don't do a whole lot else. But Frostbridge Guard kind of seems like it would, but it just doesn't. It's just a card you shouldn't be playing in white decks. Next, let's look at Curiosity. So people are taking this around pick 6.7, and it has a win rate of 52.8%. I don't get why people are taking this card as high as they are. I guess it has, you know, it's from the bonus sheet, and people see that and they want to take it. You know, I gave this a D, I think, in the set review, and I think that's about right. There are some situations where you can take Curiosity and make it do some cool stuff. Namely, if you put it on the 3-mana 0/4 who can tap to do 1 to an opponent, that gets kind of interesting, right? You can also just put it on an evasive creature. But the problem is, those are like combos that you have to set up, and most of the time, you can't. The problem with Curiosity is simply that it doesn't enhance your creature at all. So you already have to have a creature who was good at attacking for this to matter, and that kind of defeats the purpose of auras in Limited for the most part. And so, you know, overall, this doesn't work. I do think, you know, if everyone stops playing Curiosity except the people who do have like a critical mass of good combos with it, like, you know, cheap flyers and the tap instant sorcery payoff that I mentioned, its win rate probably goes up. Right now, people are clearly playing it in decks they shouldn't be, which is most of them. It's probably going to be better in the exact right deck, but that exact right deck doesn't come together often enough for you to ever take this around, you know, a 7th pick. There's also Dream Spoilers. This has a win rate of 50%, which is quite bad, and it's picked around 7th pick. This is another one that I thought would be bad going into the format, and it has panned out. 4-mana 2/2 flyer has just been a horrible stat line for, I don't know, a couple years now, mostly because there's always cards in limited formats that cost 1 mana that can kill them, and this just doesn't come with enough upside to overcome that. I mean, it's sort of like Mocking Sprite. Sure, It has more than 1 toughness, but guess what? It also costs 1 more mana, and the fact it can die to a multitude of 1 and 2 mana removal spells in the format gives you the same kind of problem Mocking Sprite has, where you just end up getting wrecked on mana, and sometimes on cards, because there are adventures in this format that can just kill this. So that is really, really painful and not something you ever want to deal with. Next up, I've got Neva, Stalked by Nightmares, and she's kind of a stand-in for all of the black-white enchantment go-to-graveyard stuff. So we already talked about how the blue-white deck didn't really pan out to be a synergistic deck, and almost every card that deals with tapping is bad. Well, almost every single card in black-white that says when a enchantment goes to the graveyard, something happens, almost all of those are bad. And this one's even better than most of them. Like, 53.4% win rate isn't good, but most of them are significantly worse. But people are also taking this one around a 5th pick. And yeah, you know, early in a format, taking Signpost Uncommons, there are going to be, on average, you're going to expect them to be powerful. This one just hasn't panned out. You know, this is somewhere where I was wrong. Like, I thought this looked pretty legit because it can get stuff back. Like, even if you never trigger the graveyard part of it, it's whatever, right? But it just hasn't panned out that way. Most of the time, sure, she can get you something back, but her small body is a huge liability in a format this aggressive. Like, there's just so many good tricks in the format, and by the time you play this thing as a 2/2, your opponent, if they're an aggressive deck and they've just like curved out 1 through 4 and then attack you, you're in a lot of trouble. Like, you can't really block any of that stuff effectively if they have mana up, because they almost certainly have a trick. So it's just, you know, inefficient creatures are really at a disadvantage here. And then on top of that, this card has this, you know, theme of when an enchantment goes to the graveyard, something happens, that almost universally throughout the set. If you read that on a card, you know, whether it's Knight of Doves or the 1 mana 1/1 cat that makes rat tokens or whatever it is, almost all of them have bad win rates, like really, really bad win rates. And that's a problem. Like, that is a flaw in this format. I think those are 2 themes that were supposed to be prevalent enough that, you know, they seeded the set with a bunch of them, but then you just have this pile of cards for 2 whole archetypes that are bad. And that's not the greatest for balance in a limited format, because those 2 decks, the black-white deck and the blue-white deck, just are kind of a train wreck. Like, they just didn't really come together. Like, even if you max out on synergy in those decks, you're not going to get there. And you're actually better. It's better in black-white and blue-white to just be a good stuff deck in this format than it is to try and do this synergy stuff, because it just doesn't pan out. And it's sad, because a lot of this look cool. Like, the artifacts, enchantments go to graveyard theme and the tap theme are both things we haven't really seen before, but I guess maybe we know why we didn't. Although, I think if they had done things a little differently, it might have worked out. Part of the problem with the blue-white deck is just that all the payoffs are uncommon, and all of the enablers at common are weak. So you end up with not getting enough payoffs and then not having good ways to enable those payoffs, and that's just a disaster. Whereas the black-white, you know, enchantments go to graveyard thing just ends up being a little too slow and grindy in a format where if you want to be slow and grindy, you need to be like gaining life and stuff, and that's just not how these things end up working out. All right, next, let's talk about Chancellor of Tales. Here's another one that I was wrong about. You know, I looked at this thing, 4 mana, 2/3 flyer, copies your adventures. That sounds amazing, right? And, you know, it can be, I guess. And I've seen it do some cool stuff, but it's in the same sort of neighborhood. You know, it's not as bad as something like Dream Spoilers. I mean, it's pretty bad. It has a 50.8% win rate, and it's picked around 6.4, which is really high. And, you know, what's funny about that is I probably have something to do with that, because I gave it a good grade in the set review and stuff. You know, like, you know, there's a reason it's like that, but a lot of people thought it was going to be good, right? Doubling adventures is good. We had a card in original Eldraine, Lucky Clover, which didn't even do anything but copy adventures, right? And it was good, and it didn't add to the board in any real way. That's not the case here, and there's a few reasons for it. Again, this is a format where you have to be pretty assertive, and if you're playing a 2/3 flyer on turn 4, pretty good chance your aggressive opponent can still just swing at you with everything. And that's just not where you want to be if you're in a deck that's trying to like make the game go long and double your adventures. So the inefficient stats here are a problem. Like, you just can't be playing things that can't do a decent job of standing up to creatures even when they have combat tricks. Like the fact that 1 and 2 mana creatures can just attack into this freely when your opponent has mana up it's a disaster in this format, and that's what's led to it not being very good. And the format is, you can be grindy, like especially if you're in something like black green or blue black. Like I've seen those decks work out to be grindy, but it's generally because they can gain life and they can outlast these aggressive opponents by playing creatures that are good at blocking and can stabilize the board. And Chancellor of Tales and Dream Spoilers just aren't that. They're not those kinds of cards. They might be better in another kind of format, but they're just not in this one. And that's sad because Doubling Adventures is cool, but I mean, it has a very bad win rate and it's taken way too highly. I don't think this is another card where if you're only playing it in the right deck, its win rate probably goes up. And that's probably kind of true of all of these. But I could see some versions of like a blue-black control deck where, you end up with enough adventures in your deck and you have enough control pieces that getting this into play is a pretty nice value engine, but you shouldn't be playing it in hardly any of your blue decks. All right, next up, let's look at Stroke of Midnight. So this is it taken the highest of all of these? Yes, it is. It's taken higher than anything else, but it also has the lowest win rate. 49% win rate, pick 5.4. It's higher than anything else we talked about in this video, and lowest win rate. This card, this kind of card always tricks people. It's just not, they're just never good. So it doesn't matter what format it is. This kind of card usually isn't anything special. Like, I think I gave it a C in the set review, and that was too high. So I overrated this card even. But if you go back and look at the comments in the white set review, there are lots of people telling me I'm an idiot because it can remove anything, right? And sure, it can, but we've seen so many effects like this. We've seen counter spells that give the opponent something. We've seen removal spells that give the opponent something. Something as meaningless as a treasure, even. If you give your opponent one of those, oftentimes that's not worth it. So giving them an actual body really isn't worth it. This, sure, it can deal with a lot of different permanent types. That flexibility is nice, but I think this win rate really proves to you that it's not enough. This would have to be cheaper, really, to really get there, I think. Because basically, sure, you can look at this as removal, but the thing to keep in mind about it is you're kind of not removing an entire card when you cast it. You're losing cards because, sure, a 1/1 token is going to be worse than whatever you kill, but you just spent 3 mana and used up a whole card to kill something. So, that part's nice, I guess. But something else, your opponent gets something out of it. So you're not getting a full card. It's not even a 1-for-1, and 1-for-1 removal spells, need to be pretty efficient. And this kind of isn't. 3 is reasonably efficient, but when you throw in that your opponent gets a 1/1, it's real bad. And so there's a few factors in this format that have made it even worse than it would be in other formats. One of them is bargain. Sure, you kill your opponent's thing, but I've been in situations, and I'm sure others have too, where you really need to get bargain going for some card in your hand, but you don't have the resources, and then your opponent kills something, and you're like, well, it sort of stinks that they killed that, but I do still have this 1/1 token that I can sacrifice to bargain. So that means you get even less value, even further away from trading 1-for-1 when you enable your opponent's bargain by giving this to them. So, every time we see these cards, they underperform. This is one of the worst performances we've seen by one of these. Admittedly, like I said, I thought it was going to be better than it is, where in reality, it's just unplayable. You just can't spend 3 mana to not get a 1-for-1 trade. You got to be killing like the biggest bombs in the format, or it's just not going to be worth it. And you don't always do that. You have to use this on stupid 3/3s and stuff sometimes, and that's when it feels even worse, when you really need to remove like a 3/3 just because it's going to kill you, and your opponent's like, well, that's even less of a downgrade for me. So, just don't play this card. Certainly don't be taking it around pick 5.4. Let's look now at Charmed Clothier. So this has a 52.9% win rate. It's taken around pick 9.3, so a little earlier than Merry Bards, but a full 2% win percentage lower. So yeah, 5 mana for a 3/3 flyer. This is another one where the rate is just not pretty. It can't put the thing on itself. If it could put the roll on itself, it would be a much better card, but it can't, and that means, again, you're spending a bunch of mana for a creature that is inefficient enough that your opponent's 1 through 4 drops that they played like ahead of you playing this can all just still attack you. Like, and that's just not where you want to be. Sure, it does add another 1/1 to the board, 1/1 worth of power and toughness, that is, because it brings you a roll token, and it does enable things like celebration. So, I mean, it's not a complete disaster if you're in a celebration deck and you have this at the top of your curve or whatever, but red-white is just filled with so many other good enablers that are way more efficient than this, that are also, you know, more aggressive and better at attacking, that you don't really need to be running this in those decks. And while I don't think the green-white enchantment deck, you know, the black-white enchantment deck is more into them going to the graveyard, right? And the green-white deck, the way they designed it, is supposed to be about having them in play, especially roll tokens. That deck hasn't flopped nearly as hard as the black-white one has, but it's kind of middling. Like, it ends up not being that good of a deck, and so cards that are kind of inefficient that make a roll token just haven't been very good, and that's what Charmed Clothier is an example of, and Merry Bards to a lesser extent too. You know, it's better than this, but it also hasn't exactly been anything special. So speaking of roll tokens, our last card also deals with them, and that is Splashy Spellcaster. This is a card I thought was going to be pretty good, and lots of people thought that because it's taken around pick 6.7, and it has a win rate of 52.4%. So this has kind of the same problem as Charmed Clothier and a lot of the other cards. It's a 4-mana 2/4, so 4 toughness. Does mean this can block some like 1-drops and 2-drops, you know, when you're playing against a red-white aggro deck and you don't have to worry about it dying. But it can't put its roll tokens on itself, which, again, that would be a much better card if you could put a roll token on itself. And a lot of the decks that it would be good in, like, you have so many spells in your deck, that also means you don't have that many creatures, and that means you can only have so many roll tokens. And sure, there are adventures, which are creatures that are also spells that can trigger this, but you know, overall, this just hasn't been impactful enough. Making one of these roll tokens hasn't been. So, you know, overall, the Spellcaster's been really underwhelming. You know, if you're in a blue-red spell deck, playing one of these isn't a disaster, but you need to have the weird combo of enough creatures for this to matter and enough spells, which, again, adventures can help you get there, but they're not enough to get you there most of the time, and most of the time, you just end up not being able to play the Spellcaster. You know, this format has panned out in such a way, like, you can have grindy decks in it, right? But you have to have grindy decks that are good at combating aggro, and these, like, 4-mana 2/4s and 3-mana 2/1s and all these, you know, other things we've seen come up time and again in this video don't do that. Like, they just aren't good at combating aggro. So you've got to be, like I said earlier, you know, you've got to be adding to the board, like, real bodies that can trade consistently. You need to have interaction, and you need to be gaining life. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to stabilize against this format's aggro decks, and none of the cards we talked about in this video help you do any of that. So, you know, the short version is, overall, the reason these cards are bad is because aggro is really good in the format. You know, there are a few cards that have other stuff, you know, going on other than that. Like, Mocking Sprite being bad is, and a lot of X1s being bad is just because of all the X1 hate in the format. But you know, overall, a lot of these cards are being taken higher because in some limited formats they would be better. I mean, there's exceptions like Stroke of Midnight. Sure, it would be better, but it's been, that kind of card is never good in limited, and it certainly isn't here. So those are the 10 bad Wilds of Eldraine card that you need to stop playing, and certainly taking this early. Some of them you can play in an emergency, I guess, but none of these, there's not a single card we talked about in this video that you really ever feel good about having in your deck. Even if you're talking about Curiosity and getting it alongside the right sort of combo pieces I was talking about, you still don't feel great about playing it because it's bad in all the situations where you don't get those combo pieces. It's just like not an F in that sort of deck, but it's still pretty bad. Next week, I'll be back to look at the opposite, where I'll be taking a look at cards that are being taken later than they should based on the win percentage they've managed to accumulate in the format. But that does it for this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like it and share it. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past videos, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.